The Landlady, written by Roald Dahl and narrated by Nigel Hoppingstone. Billy Weaver had travelled down from London on the slow afternoon train with a change of Swindon on the way, and by the time he got to Bath, it was about 9 o'clock in the evening, and the moon was coming up, out of a clear starry sky over the houses opposite the station entrance. But the air was deadly cold, and the wind was like a flat plate of ice on his cheeks. Excuse me, he said, but is there a fairly cheap hotel not too far away from here? Try the Bell and Dragon, the porter answered, pointing down the road. Might take you in. It's about a quarter mile along the other side. Billy thanked him and picked up his suitcase and set out to walk the quarter mile to the Bell and Dragon. He had never been to Bath before. He didn't know anyone who lived there, but Mr. Greenslade at the head office in London had told him it was a splendid city. Find your lodgings, he had said, and then go along and report to the branch manager as soon as you've got yourself settled. Billy was 17 years old. He was wearing a new navy blue coat, a new brown trilby hat, and a fine new brown suit, and he was feeling wonderful. He walked briskly down the street, trying to do everything briskly these days. Briskness, he had decided, was the one common characteristic of all the successful businessmen. The big shots up at head office were always absolutely fantastically brisk, all the time. They were amazing. There were no shops on this wide street that he was walking along, only a line of tall houses on either side, all identical. They had porches and pillars and 4 or 5 steps going up to their front doors, and it was obvious that once upon a time they had been very swanky residences. But now, even in the darkness, he could see that the paint was peeling from the woodwork and on the doors and the windows, and that their handsome white facades were cracked and blotchy from neglect. Suddenly, in a downstairs window that was brightly illuminated by a street lamp not 6 yards away, Billy caught sight of a printed notice propped up against the glass in one of the upper panes. It read, Bed and Breakfast. There was a vase of yellow chrysanthemums, tall and beautiful, standing underneath the notice. He stopped walking. He moved a bit closer. Green curtains, some sort of velvety material, were hanging down on either side of the window. The chrysanthemums looked wonderful beside them. He went right up and peered through the glass into the room, and the first thing he saw was a bright fire burning in the hearth. On the carpet, in front of the fire, a pretty little dachshund was curled up asleep with its nose tucked into its belly. The room itself, so far as he could see in the half-darkness, was filled with pleasant furniture. There was a baby grand piano, and a big sofa and several plump armchairs. And in one corner, he spotted a large parrot in a cage. Animals were usually a good sign in a place like this, Billy told himself, and all in all, it looked pretty good to him, and it would be pretty decent to stay in. It would certainly be much more comfortable than the Bell and Dragon. On the other hand, a pub would be more congenial than a boarding house. There would be beer and darts in the evening, and lots of people to talk to, and it would probably be a good bit cheaper too. He'd stayed a couple nights in pubs before, and he had liked it. He had never stayed in a boarding house, and, to be perfectly honest, he was a bit frightened of them. The very name itself conjured up images of watery cabbage, rapacious landladies, and the powerful smell of kippers in the living room. After dithering about like this, in the cold, for 2 or 3 minutes, Billy decided that he would walk on and take a look at the Bell and Dragon before making up his mind. He turned to go, and now a queer thing happened to him. He was in the act of stepping back and turning away from the window, when all at once, his eye was caught and held in the most peculiar manner by the small notice that was there. Bed and breakfast, it had said. Bed and breakfast. Bed and breakfast. Bed and breakfast. Each word was like a large black eye staring at him through the glass, holding him, compelling him, forcing him to stay where he was, and not to walk away from the house. And the next thing he knew, he was actually moving across from the window to the front door of the house, climbing to the steps that led him to it, and reaching for the bell. He pressed the bell. Far away in a back room, he heard it ringing, and then at once, it must have been at once because he didn't have time to take his finger off the doorbell, the door swung open, and a woman was standing there. Usually you ring a bell, and you have at least half a minute's wait before the door opens. But this dame was like a jack-in-a-box. He pressed the bell, and out she popped. It made him jump. She was about 45 or 50 years old, and the moment she saw him, She gave a welcoming, warm smile. "Please, come in," she said pleasantly. She stepped aside, holding the door wide open, and Billy found himself automatically starting forward into the house. The compulsion, or more accurately, the desire to follow her into that house was extraordinarily strong. "I saw the notice in the window," he said, holding himself back. "Yes, I know. I was wondering about a room. It's all ready for you, my dear," she said. She had a round, pink face and very gentle blue eyes. I was on my way to the Bell and Dragon, but the notice in your window just happened to catch my eye." "My dear boy," she said, "why don't you come out of the cold?" How much do you charge?" 5 and 6 pence a night, including breakfast." It was fantastically cheap. It was less than half of what he was willing to pay. "If that is too much," she added, "then perhaps I shall reduce it a tiny bit. Do you desire an egg for breakfast?" "Eggs are very expensive at the minute. It would be 6 pence less without the egg." 5 and 6 pence is fine," he answered. "I should really like to stay here." "I knew you would. Do come in." She seemed terribly nice. She looked exactly like the mother of one's best school friend welcoming one into the house to stay for the Christmas holidays. Billy took off his hat and stepped over the threshold. "Just hang in there," she said, "and let me help you with your coat." There were no other hats or coats in the hall. There were no umbrellas, no walking sticks, nothing. "We have it all to ourselves," she said, smiling at him over her shoulder, as she led the way upstairs. "You see, it isn't very often I have the pleasure of taking a visitor into my little nest." The old girl is slightly dotty, Billy told himself. But at 5 and 6 pence a night, who gives a damn about this? "I should have thought you'd be simply swarmed by applicants," he said politely. "Oh, I am, my dear, I am. Of course I am. The trouble is that I'm inclined to be a teeny-weeny bit choosy and particular, if you know what I mean." "Oh, yes." "But I'm always ready. Everything in this house, ready day and night in this house, just on the off chance that an acceptable young gentleman will come along. And it is such a pleasure, my dear, such a very great pleasure, that now and again I open the door and I see someone standing there who is just exactly right." She was exactly halfway up the stairs, and she paused with one hand on the stair rail, turning her head and smiling at him with pale lips. "Like you," she added, and her blue eyes travelled slowly all the way down the length of Billy's body, to his feet, and then up once again. On the first floor landing, she told him, "This floor is mine." They climbed up a second flight. "And this one is all yours," she said. "Here's your room. I hope you like it." She took him into a small but charming front bedroom, switching on the light as she went in. "The morning sun comes right in the window, Mr. Perkins. It is Perkins, isn't it?" No," he said. "It's Weaver." "Weaver. How nice. I've put a bottle between the sheets to air them out, Mr. Weaver. It's such a comfort to have a hot water bottle in the strange bed with clean sheets, don't you agree? And you may light the gas fire at any time, if you feel a bit chilly." Thank you," Billy said. "Thank you ever so much." He noticed that the bedspread had been taken off the bed, and that the bedclothes had been neatly turned on one side, all ready for someone to get in it. "I am so glad you appeared," she said, looking honestly into his face. "I was beginning to get worried." That's all right," Billy answered brightly. "You mustn't worry about me." He put his suitcase on the chair and started to open it. "And what about supper, my dear? Did you manage to eat anything before you came here?" "I'm not a bit hungry, thank you," he said. "I think I'll just go to bed as soon as possible, because tomorrow I have to get up rather early and report to the office." "Very well, then. I'll leave you now so you can unpack. But before you go to bed, would you be kind enough to pop into the sitting room on the ground floor and sign the book? Everyone has to, because it's the law of the land, and we don't want to go breaking any laws at this stage in the proceedings, do we?" She gave him a little wave of the hand, and went quickly out the room and closed the door. Now, the fact that this landlady appeared to be slightly off her rocker didn't worry Billy at all. Not in the least. After all, she was not only harmless, there was no question about that, but she was also quite obviously a kind and generous soul. He guessed that she had probably lost a son in the war, or something like that, and had never gotten over it. So a few minutes later, after unpacking his suitcase and washing his hands, he trotted downstairs into the ground floor and entered the living room. His landlady wasn't there, but the fire was glowing in the hearth and the little dachshund was still sleeping in front of it. The room was wonderfully cozy and warm. I'm a lucky fellow, he thought, rubbing his hands. This is a bit of all right. He found the guest book lying on the piano, so he took out his pen and wrote his name and address. There were only 2 other entries above this page, and, as one always does with guest books, he started to read them. One was a Christopher Mulholland from Cardiff. The other was Gregory W. Temple from Bristol. That's funny, he thought. Christopher Mulholland rings a bell. No, hang on. Where on earth had he heard that rather unusual name before? Was he a boy at school? No. Was it one of his sister's numerous young men? Perhaps. Or a friend of his father's? No. He glanced down at the book again. Christopher Mulholland, 231 Cathedral Road in Cardiff, and Gregory W. Temple, 27 Sycamore Drive, Bristol. As a matter of fact, now that he came to think of it, he wasn't sure at all that the second name didn't almost have as much a familiar ring about it as the first. Gregory Temple, he said out loud, searching his memory. Christopher Mulholland. Such charming boys. A voice behind him answered, and he turned around to see his landlady, sailing into the room with a large silver tea tray in her hands. She was holding it well out in front of her, and rather high up, as though the tray were a pair of reins on a very frisky horse. They all sound familiar. They do? How interesting. I'm almost positive I heard those names before. Somewhere. Isn't it queer? Maybe it was in the newspapers. They weren't famous in any way. Famous cricketers or footballers or anything like that. Famous, she said, setting the tea tray down on the low table in front of the sofa. Oh no, I don't think they were famous. They were both extraordinarily handsome, both of you, I can tell you that. They were tall and young and handsome, my dear, just like you. Once more, Billy glanced down at the book. Look here, he said, noticing the dates. The last entry is over 2 years old. Is it now? Yes, indeed, and Christopher Mulholland's is nearly a year before, more than 3 years ago. Dear me, she said, shaking her head and heaving a dainty little sigh. I would never have thought it. How time flies away from all of us, doesn't it, Mr. Wilkins? It's Weaver, said Billy. Weaver. Oh, of course it is, she cried, sitting down on the sofa. How silly of me, I do apologize. In one ear and out the other, that's me, Mr. Weaver. You know something, said Billy. Something that's really quite extraordinary about all of this. No, dear, I don't. Well, you see, both of these names are Mulholland and Temple. I not only seem to remember each one of them separately, so to speak, but somehow or other, in some peculiar way, they both seem to be sort of connected together as well, as if they were both famous for the same sort of thing, if you see what I mean. Like Dempsey and Turney, or Flanagan and Allen, or Churchill and Roosevelt. Oh, how amusing, she said. But come over here now, dear, and sit down beside me on the sofa, and I'll get you a nice cup of tea and a ginger biscuit before you go to bed. Oh, you shouldn't bother. You really shouldn't, said Billy. I didn't mean you to do anything like that. He stood by the piano and watched her as she fussed about with the cups and saucers. He noticed she had small, white, quickly moving hands and red fingernails. Now, I'm almost positive it was in the newspapers I saw them, said Billy. I think of it in a second. I'm not sure I will. There was nothing more tantalizing than a thing like this which lingers outside the borders of one's memory. He hated to give up. Now, wait a minute, he said. Wait just a minute. Mulholland. Christopher Mulholland. What? Wasn't he the name of the Eton schoolboy who was on a walking tour throughout the West Coast and all of a sudden... Milk? Sugar? She said. Yes, please. And then all of a sudden... Eton schoolboy? She said. Oh no, my dear, that can't possibly be right because my Mr. Mulholland was certainly no Eton schoolboy when he came to me. He was a Cambridge undergraduate. Come over here and sit next to me and warm yourself up in this lovely fire. Come on, it's all ready for you. Lovely. She patted the empty space beside her on the sofa, and she sat there, smiling at Billy, and waiting for him to come over. He crossed the room slowly and sat down on the edge of the sofa. He placed his teacup on the table in front of him. There we are, she said. How nice and cozy all this is, isn't it? Billy started sipping his tea. She did the same. For half a minute, neither of them spoke. But Billy knew she was looking at him. Her body was half turned towards him, and he could feel her eyes resting upon his face, watching him over the rim of her teacup. Now and again, he caught a whiff of a peculiar smell that seemed to emanate directly from her person. It was not in the least bit unpleasant, and it reminded him of... Well, he wasn't quite sure what it reminded him of. Pickled walnuts? New leather? The corridors of a hospital? Mr. Mulholland was a great one for his tea, she said at length. Never in my life have I seen someone drink as much tea as dear, sweet Mr. Mulholland. I suppose he left fairly recently, said Billy. He was still puzzling in his head about the two names. He was positive now he had seen at least one of them in the newspapers, in the headlines. Left? She said, arching her brows. But, my dear boy, he never left. He's still here. Mr. Temple is here as well. They're on the third floor, both of them together. Billy sat down, his cup slowly on the table, and stared at his landlady. She smiled back at him, and then she pulled out one of her white hands and patted him comfortingly on the knee. How old are you, my boy? She said. 17. 17! She cried. Oh, it's the perfect age. Mr. Mulholland was also 17. I think he was a trifle shorter than you are. In fact, I'm sure he was. And his teeth weren't so white. You have most beautiful teeth, Mr. Weaver. Do you know that? They're not as good as they look, said Billy. They've got simply masses of fillings in the back of them. Mr. Temple, of course, was a little older, she said, ignoring his remark. He was actually 28, and I never would have guessed it if he hadn't told me. Never in my whole life. There wasn't a blemish on his body. A what? Said Billy. His skin was just like a baby's. There was a slight pause. Billy picked up his teacup and took another sip of his tea, and then he sat it down again, gently on his saucer. He waited for her to say something else, but she also seemed to have lapsed into another one of her silences. He sat there, staring straight ahead of him into the far corner of the room, biting his lower lip. That parrot, he said, at last. You know something? It had completely fooled me when I first saw it in the window from the street. I could have sworn it was alive. Alas, no longer. It's most terribly clever the way it's been done, he said. Doesn't look in the least bit dead. Who did it? I did. You did? Of course. And have you met my little Basil as well? She nodded towards the dash and curled up comfortably in front of the fire. Billy suddenly looked at it, and suddenly he realized that this animal had all the time been as silent and motionless as the parrot. He pulled out a hand and touched it gently on the top of its back. The back was hard and cold, and when he pushed the hair to the side with his fingers, he could see the skin underneath, grayish black and dry, and perfectly preserved. Goodness gracious me, he said. Absolutely fascinating. He turned away from the dog and stared with deep admiration at the little woman beside him on the sofa. It must have been awfully difficult to do a thing like that. Oh, not in the least, she said. I stuff all my little pets myself when they pass away. Will you have another cup of tea? No, thank you, said Billy. The tea tasted faintly of bitter almonds, and he didn't much care for it. You did sign the book, didn't you? Oh, yes. That's good, because later on, if I happen to forget what you are called, I can always come to that almost every day. With Mr. Mulholland and Mr. Oh dear, Mr. Temple, said Billy. Gregory Temple. Excuse my asking, but haven't there been any other guests except them in the last 2 to 3 years? Holding her teacup high in one hand, inclining her head slightly to the left, she looked up at him, out of the corner of her eyes, and gave another gentle little smile. No, my dear, she said. Only you. Happy Halloween from Broccoli and Jonas Productions, and may your Hallows Eve be filled with spooks of all sorts.